Okay, welcome to this week's OCTF seminar, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ana Benitez-Lopez, who did a PhD at the University of Castilla-La Mancha in Spain, and is now a postdoctoral research fellow at the Estación Biológica de Doñana in Spain. And her work covers a number of aspects around defaunation, both the patterns of defaunation and its consequences for ecosystems. And thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing your presentation. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Alvinder. Thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be able to present here today. So I think I'm just gonna go ahead with it. I will share my screen. Right. All right, so the title of my talk today is Defaunation and Trophic Cascading in the Anthropocene, Ecological Erosion in the Tropics. And I will cover some aspects of the research I've been doing in the past years. I want to acknowledge my current funding given by the Ministry of Science and Innovation in Spain, and also my previous institution, which is Radboud University, and now the Doñana Biological Station in Spain. So the outline of my presentation is this one. First, I'm going to talk about how we can quantify and predict hunting-induced defaunation across the tropics. Then I will move on explaining a couple of papers where we actually combine the effects of hunting and habitat loss due to land use change on mammal distribution. And then I will talk about the work I've been doing in the last year about the cascading effects of deformation on vegetation composition in the tropics, which is ongoing work, and I will share some preliminary results I'm getting. So, well, I guess most of you know what the defaunation is, but for those that don't know it, it's basically the loss of species and populations of wildlife, as well as the local decline in abundance of individuals, and is due to human activities. And one of the signatures of this process is that it affects mostly the large body species. So if you focus on this graph on the left, which was published by Dirso and colleagues some years ago, what they show is the body mass distribution of the species that went extinct during the Pleistocene and during the Anthropocene, which is arguably the era that we are living right now. If we compare them to the body mass distribution of the species that are currently threatened or non-threatened, we see that those that are non-threatened are sensibly smaller than those that went extinct or are threatened. And the main drivers of defaunation are habitat modification, which is this red part you see in this graph, and direct exploitation, mostly due to hunting. So hunting per se is not bad. I mean, like, humans have been doing it for millennia across the world, and particularly in the tropics. Basically, it's an activity to secure your daily protein intake, and basically to be able to feed your families in areas where this is your main access to protein. But nowadays, it's not sustainable, or it's becoming not sustainable in some areas. And this is because of several reasons. The most important ones are that, well, there are way more humans in the planet. There's been an exponential human population growth, which means that there are more people demanding wild meats and also body parts. Also, roads have been developed into remote areas across the tropics to being able to access natural resources such as timber or gas or for mining operations. And that means that some areas have become accessible for hunters, and they can actually hunt those populations that were previously inaccessible. Furthermore, there's been a modernization of hunting techniques, from hunting with bow and arrow to using shotguns, or even using, there's a recent paper showing how hunters are switching to hunt during the night using LED flashlights, for example. And that means that they're becoming more efficient, and they're able to capture more animals per unit time. That also helps to actually transition from subsistence hunting, so basically hunting just for your family or to feed your children, to basically commercialize the spare meat that you have in local markets and also in international markets. This is also benefited by the fact that because of all the roads that have been built, now it's easier to move to these local markets to actually commercialize them. So some figures estimate the extraction rates in the tropics, or particularly in the Congo Basin, are around 65 million animals per year, which account for 5 million tons animal per year. But that's not only in the Congo Basin, as you see in the graph. Areas like Indonesia, Amazon, and so on, they also have very high extraction rates. So a couple of years ago, already 4, I would say, I was wondering how we could kind of quantify and estimate the impact of these harvest rates on the abundance of population. So not only how many animals we're extracting, but what this means for the populations of tropical mammals and birds. And what we used in this paper we published in 2017 is the idea of hunters being central place foragers. That means that they basically forage for resources in the proximity of access points, which may be settlements, or they could be roads, or so on. And that means that hunting pressure is usually higher in the proximity of these access points, and it declines as we go farther into the forest, which creates gradients in species densities, which reach almost carrying capacity the farther we go into the forest in areas that are unhunted or slightly hunted. So with this idea in mind, we collected data from a large number of local hunting studies, which were looking actually at this kind of relationships between species abundance and distance to villages, settlements, or roads. And we performed this systematic review and collected data on over 250 mammal species and around 100 bird species. Because every study reports abundance in a different metric, because they're using different methods, like for example, camera traps or line transects or counts of tracks in sand plots. So in order to standardize all these metrics into something that we could all analyze together, we use these response ratios, which is an effect size commonly used in meta-analysis. And with these response ratios, we divided the mean abundance in the metric reporting in the study in hunted areas divided by the mean abundance in control or unhunted areas, which give us an unitless kind of metric that we can use for synthesizing information across multiple studies. So what you have to bear in mind is that positive values, because this is log transform, right? So positive values means that abundances are higher in hunted areas, and negative values means that abundances are lower in hunted areas, and 0 means that there's no change. So what you see here is the distribution of all the response ratios that we collected across all species and studies. And we see that there are some bird species and mammal species that have positive values, so they're benefited by, in hunted areas, they have higher abundances, but the vast majority have negative values, and some of them are locally extirpated. Basically, they are wiped out from those hunted areas. If we back transform these values into the RINA scale, so into percentages, we estimate that bird populations, mammal populations are reduced by 58 and 83% in hunted forests compared to unhunted forests. Furthermore, we also related these log response ratios with the distance to hunters' access points to try to have an idea of those depletion distances where animal populations were reduced. Right? So these are the kind of plots that we produce. Again, you have on the y-axis the effect size, which is the response ratio. Everything above 0 is a positive effect, and below 0 is a negative effect on animal abundance in this case. And the size of the points differ because it reflects the precision of the study, which was accounted for in the meta-analysis. So overall, what we estimate is that bird populations and mammal populations are reduced within 7 and 40 kilometers from hunters' access points, which is super large distance, especially in the case of mammals. That means that every time you build a road across the tropics, the impact of that road doesn't have to be only the habitat which becomes lost because of the construction of the road or some kind of noise effects you may have along the road, but also by providing access to humans or to hunters in this case, the impacts of building that road would be way larger than anticipated. So with all these results, I was triggered by the idea of, okay, can we use this information to try to have an idea of how defaunation vary across the tropics? Can we pinpoint areas where mammal populations are being hunted at very high levels? And this is what prompted me to do my next paper. And I wanted to understand not only the spatial variation of hunting-induced defaunation across the tropics, but also how this might differ across, for animals of different body size. And this is because usually body size is related to hunting pressure in terms of species that are being targeted preferably by hunters are normally large size species, but these are also species that have slow reproductive rates and more difficult or more complicated for them to recover from hunting. Okay, the challenge here was that in contrast with another threat, which is deforestation, that can be tracked from well, remote sensing and satellite images, this is not possible to do for hunting. Here, for these are two images of the clear fishbone pattern, which is really common in tropical areas due to logging operations. And in this case, this is the case of Rondonia, which I guess most of you know. But in the case of hunting activities, in many cases, they occur under the canopy of seemingly undisturbed forests like this one. And this means that forests that might be, or they may look intact, pristine, may be actually empty, which is a concept that Redford coined already in 1992, the empty forest syndrome, the fact that some forests may be devoid of animal populations or half empty animal populations. So with this idea in mind, I also wanted to see if those intact forest landscapes that have been mapped by others in different projects, whether these were actually intact or by applying models of hunting-induced defaunation, we could pinpoint areas that may seem intact, but they could be well, basically half empty or with populations of mammals that would be substantially reduced. So in this case, I focused on the intact forest landscapes from Potapok and others, which is based actually on the Hansen forest cover data set. In dark green, what you see are those forests that they have that they consider intact based on remote sensing. And on the right side, what you see is the Human Footprint Project from Venter, Watson, and others. And the map actually was the human footprint across the world based on different land cover layers, but also infrastructure development and so on. But in none of these cases, they actually took into account the impact of overhunting. I mean, in the case of the Human Footprint Project, they assume some kind of effect shown across some infrastructure, but it's constant across the world, so it doesn't really vary. So, so what I did is expand on the database, on the data set I collected for the previous paper. Here I focus only on mammals. And then we went from 250 to almost 300 mammal species. And we increased the abundance response ratios that we included in the models. And this is the distribution of all the studies we included, which roughly represent most areas across the tropics, except for, I would say, China, and then some areas in Papua New Guinea and so on. And besides using distance to hunters' access point as a predictor of hunting pressure, I was interested in exploring the effect of other potential drivers. So I included also human population density as a proxy of demand for wild meats, also the travel time to major towns, which is a proxy for the accessibility to urban markets, to where the meat could be commercialized. I also included an indicator of poverty, which is the prevalence of stunting or child malnutrition, to basically account for the fact that maybe some local communities would be more reliant on wild meats to actually meet their dietary needs. And in this same line, I also included food security, so like the amount of livestock biomass that could be potentially available. So basically, if you have access to the domestic biomass, maybe you don't need to hunt wild meat. And the last one was the protection status of the area. So basically, the IGN protected areas layer. So I combine so the location of the hunting studies with abundance estimates with all these spatially specific rasters. And I also included species traits as a proxy for species vulnerability to hunting, which were body mass mostly, but I also included diet. And then in this case, what I did is to model the probability of being extirpated. So basically the zeros and ones of the models, and then the abundance reduction in a harder modeling framework, which I combined to project across all mammal ranges in the tropics. So I produce a raster for each mammal species, predicting the impact of hunting on their abundance. And then I stack them into a hunting-induced deformation map across all the species. For the ease of communicating the results, what I did is to back transform the response ratio and subtract it from 1. So then to arrive to a deformation index, which ranges from 0 to 1. And here, a value of 1 indicates that the area is being fully deformated, or the species has been fully deformated for species-specific deformation rasters. Whereas when the deformation index is 0 or somewhere below 0.1, we consider the population to be intact. So first I'm going to discuss some important drivers of hunting pressure. These are the results for the binomial models, basically the probability of becoming, the probability of surviving local extirpation, which, as you can see, is higher the further we are from distant hunters' access point, and it decreases with human population density, species body mass, and interestingly increases with the prevalence of stunting. So basically child malnutrition, which indicates that actually the poorer communities are not the ones exerting the higher pressure on mammal populations. Finally, for studies conducted within protected areas, for those species, the probability of surviving local extirpation into hunting was also higher. And for the abundance part of the model, changes in mammals abundance, here what I include is an interaction between distance to hunters' access points and species body mass, because usually species which are of a small size are usually not targeted by hunters, but also they may become released from a competition and predation and become benefited by hunting pressure on other species, which is actually what the models or the relationship show. No? Like the rodents and the smaller size species are and on higher, they have higher abundance than large body species, which are much more depleted within the proximity of hunters' access points. And again, human population density was a main driver of decline in abundance. So I projected the models across all the species, I stacked them together, and then I arrived to this map of the defaunation. In blue, you see areas which are supposedly intact, or let's say they are not defaunated, and those in yellowy, orange, and red, those are areas which are highly defaunated. So what we estimate is that around 50% of the pantropical forest zone is under some degree of defaunation. That means values of the defaunation index above 0.1. Overall, it seems that the map look quite bluish. Problem here is that because I projected, or I used the model to project across all species regardless of the body size, this map also includes a lot of small size species, which are actually over 60%, I would say, of the data included. So if we focus on the medium size and large size species, the picture changes dramatically, and then we see much more redder areas in Colombia, Central America, also in West Africa, along the East Coast here in Africa as well, China and Southeast Asia in general, and so on. In this case, what we see is that 60% and 80% of the area where medium-sized species and large-sized species is under some degree of deformation. And it's particularly worrying that there are a lot of cells around this area, around a deformation index of 0.6 to 0.8, which is actually abundance reduction of about 70%. So we use this threshold to try to pinpoint hotspots where species were being, or where populations of mammal species were highly reduced. And this is what you see here. These are species with a deformation index of over 0.7. And the colors show the percentage of species per grid cell, which have a deformation index of over 0.7, so 70% abundance reduction. And again, we see that one of the most problematic areas is West Africa, but also in Sri Lanka and some areas in Southeast Asia. Some of these areas are home for some of the more endangered species, and many of them are highly threatened by the international wildlife trade, and mostly illegal wildlife trades like the pangolin, tiger, or clouded leopard. Next up, we confronted the human footprint maps and the intact forest landscapes maps with our maps of defaunation. If we use the overall defaunation map across all the species, we see that around 11% to 9% of the areas considered intact by those two projects could be defaunated, and these numbers go higher or they become much larger for when we take into account the large bodied species, as you see here. Well, now I'm gonna continue to the second part of the talk, in which I discuss how we can combine impacts of the two main threats, so land use change and hunting, to quantify or estimate changes in the distribution of mammals. So in the first case, this was a collaboration with Juan Gallego Zamorano from Radar University, a former colleague of mine. And here, what we did is to use a deductive approach in terms of the habitat preferences of the mammals. So use the IUCN species ranges and habitat preferences. And then we use the binomial part of my model. So the model predicting the probability of surviving or not extirpation to account for areas that might be lost due to hunting pressure. So first, we refine the ranges of each species based on their habitat preferences and elevation maps. And then we use the ESA land cover maps to try to understand how much area within those refined ranges was lost to land use. And then we projected my models to account for hunting pressure and combine everything together. So what you see here is the relative area loss for species of different body size. Main takeaway here is that land use seem to affect similarly across the whole range of body sizes, whereas as we have learned from my previous research, species of larger body size are mostly affected by hunting. And this is the area lost to overlap of these two pressures. If we combine all these together, what we estimate is that the species distributions are reduced by 40% on average within their range. We also projected the results of this approach in different maps. And here you see examples for the spider monkeys, a species which is mostly affected by loss from land use. In this case, deforestation is an arboreal species. Then the species which is mostly affected by hunting pressure, and then a species that is affected by both threats simultaneously. So we took all this information and stacked them together to produce these cool spots and hotspots of area loss across the tropics, and some areas will become very clearly impacted, like the Atlantic forest, Colombia again, West Africa, and again here around Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. And then the other case study I wanted to present to you today is work where I collaborated with Alfredo Romero from Humboldt University. Here we zoom in into a specific area, which is the Argentinian Chaco, the South American Chaco, which is the largest dry tropical forest in the world, and it's a frontier forest where massive deforestation is occurring due to expansion of cattle ranching and soybean. But there's also hunting pressure due to, the different ranches there. The people living there, they also hunt some species, either for recreational purposes, but also for feeding on them, or for retaliation in the case of the Jaguar. Here we focused on the mammal assemblage of species over 1 kilogram, and instead of using a deductive approach, so focusing on habitat preferences of the species, we use an inductive approach. So actually modeling habitat preferences based on occurrence data collected during the last 40 years. So we have like almost 30,000 presence points for those 48 mammal species in different moments of the last 40 years, and we match those with land cover maps at high resolution, which were produced actually by the same by some of the lab members. And we match the land cover of a certain period with the occurrence data of that certain period, so to have some time calibrated habitat suitability models fitted. And then in this case, we use my my defaunation models, fit it to the Latin American species to project hunting pressure using 27,000 subsistence ranches as access points plus the roads in the area. And then combine everything together to identify areas which are core, that are good, there's no threat from any of these activities, or areas where both threats act together or only one of the two is acting. So we did it for each species, and then we stacked them again all together to have an idea on how the footprints of both threats changed across time from 1985 until roughly nowadays, so 2015. So what you see here is for cattle ranching or deforestation or land use change on top, and then hunting pressure below. The colors in the map represent the number of species affected by one threat or the other. And here on the right-hand side, you see the change in from 1985 to 2015. So overall, it seems like there's been there's been an increase in the impact of both threats, mostly in Paraguay, and then across the entire Chaco, both have expanded, covering 40% of this area. We can also visualize this using these Byvariate plots, where in purple you see where both threats are acting together, in blue where species are basically in a poor habitat. The land use change have rendered some of the areas not suitable for them, and then in yellow where there's high hunting pressure. And here we can see again the same pattern, no? Like some of the areas that were in the past only affected by high hunting pressure, seems like some people might have settled there, and they have started to convert the forest into soybean crops or pasture, or just basically for pasture for cattle, and then it's becoming more and more impacted by both threats. If we focus on the species, here in this graph, what you see is the percentage of habitat destruction affecting some species and the percentage of increasing hunting pressure affecting other species. And we see that mostly most species have been or are affected by increasing habitat destruction and hunting pressure, but some of them, like the armadillos, are only affected by hunting pressure. And again, what we see the change from 1985 to 2015 is that it's mostly Paraguay, the country which has the worst, I would say, particularly regarding habitat destruction. But it's also important to note here that in Argentina, most of the deforestation happened before the 80s, so it's also normal that the changes there are much lower. So now I'm going to focus on the third part of the talk, and here, well, of course, after working on defaunation for some years, the next, at least for me, was the next natural step was to understand what implications these have for ecosystem functioning. So many of these species that are being hunted are actually frugivores, and they play a very important role on dispersal and forest regeneration in the tropics, where actually the vast majority of the species are dispersed by animals and rely on them for recruitment of new individuals. So yeah, the question is, okay, so we are losing all these species. Is this having an effect on vegetation composition? There are many studies working on this topic, but we have a common consensus. Is this context dependent? And yeah, the idea is nicely pictured here by Carolina Bello and colleagues, where When you have an initial community, normally what you have is, what we have seen across the talk is that large body herbivores become extinct or functionally extinct. That means that such a lower abundance that they're not able to perform their functions anymore. And then we could end up with a defaunated community composed mostly of a small species, which only disperse small seeded species. And I will come back to this later. So to put it in a very simplistic manner, across the plant cycle, what happens is that if plants want to recruit new members, normally they rely on some primary seed dispersers. They are mutualistic species that feed on the fruit and disperse the seeds somewhere else, which is good because then it allows the seeds to escape pathogens and predators, according to the Janssen and Connell hypothesis. And that means that seeds fall somewhere else. But here, seeds may be predated, but in this case, well, this is, of course, a South American forest example, but in this case, it could be peccaries, and we may have squirrels and agoutis predating on these seeds, so having a negative effect on the potential recruitment of these propagals. And interestingly, some of these predators may also act as a secondary disperser by hoarding the seeds and burying them somewhere else where they could become a seedling. And of course, we also have dung beetles, which rely on the dung of large mammals, and they also act as secondary dispersers in many cases. So once the seed is established, and we may have also herbivores having a negative impact on these seedlings, or just because they feed on them, or because of trampling, or whatever, which may also happen in some cases as in the sapling stage. So this is what happens more or less in an intact community, but in a defaunated forest, we may have species that have disappeared, or they are at lower abundance, or others have been released by from competition and predation, and they become overabundant. So all these processes may be altered, leading to some net recruitment rate, which we are not sure yet what they are. I mean, some people have found that this may have positive impacts, some others negative. It's not very clear. So the idea is, okay, if we compare what's happening in intact versus defaunated forests across all the life stages in this cycle, can we find first if there's a bottleneck somewhere across the process where propagals were not being, they would not transition to the next phase and then become an adult in the future, or yeah, basically the question is what's going on. So can we collect all this information for defaunated and intact forests, which are similar in other characteristics regarding vegetation and so on, but other than that, they have altered animal communities. Can we collect this information and compare it and see where there might be a bottleneck? So that's what I've been doing. Initially, I want to focus mostly on the seedling density, but then my colleague here, Pedro Jordano, convinced me to look at everything. So this has become a super large project, but okay, it's getting to an end slowly. So far I have collected all this data. Some of these numbers will be updated very soon because I'm still finishing up going through the data. Going through the studies I found. But you see that there's a range of studies across the tropics, mostly in South America, for different stages across the process. And what I'm going to show here are preliminary results. And of course, this is being recorded and it's going on YouTube. But yeah, of course, it would be great if they are not mal used or misused. Anyways, so what we're finding so far, it's the following. Here we have again the response ratio. So negative values mean that we have a negative impact on fruit removal, dispersal, whatever. Positive values is a positive impact. So when we compare what's happening in defaunted forest versus impact forest, we see that for all these different processes, there's a negative effect. In some cases, less clear. For example, seed dispersers, so basically how many seeds arrive to the ground. Although in a few slides, I will show you some nuances around this. And when we back transform this to the arena scale, we estimate a 40% to 70% decline in these processes. Now, another question here that we can explore is how, like normally seeds or fruits that are belong to plant species in non-deformated versus deformated forest, so how are they dispersed? Where are the dispersal distances? And normally in non-deformated forest, you will have this kind of seed shadows, right? Like fruit girl comes, take the fruit, take it somewhere else, or feed on it, and then you have some gut retention time, goes somewhere else, defecates, the seeds get dispersed at a certain distance. Now, we have deformated forest where large species are supposedly they are extinct, they're not there anymore. What we have left are the medium-sized species. Normally they have smaller dispersal distance, so the seed shadow becomes reduced, and in deformated forest, sometimes the fruits don't become dispersed at all, they fall onto the ground of the parent tree, they stay there. And then, well, they may be attacked by pathogens, or predators normally predate on the parent trees, or you may have competition between seedlings of the same parent tree. So normally they don't become viable. So what I did is also to compare how this plays out with my data for seed dispersal and for seedling establishment. And what we find is that in the deformated forest, most of the seeds are under parent trees and most of the seedlings, so the abundance are higher under parent trees, and there are way less seeds that are dispersed or seedlings that are established away from parent trees. Okay, last on this topic, this is a paper that we published earlier this year with Licio Possessive. This was a collaboration. He just stayed some time in our lab, and we talked about this, and then we put this meta-analysis together. Here we focus on dung beetles, so basically secondary dispersers. And here what you see is with the effects of hunting and fragmentation, so patch size on the abundance of and richness of dung beetles. So dung beetles rely on mammal dung, and then they extract the seeds and bury them somewhere else, as I explained before. And then these seeds may become seedlings eventually. So what we see is that in forests under very intense hunting pressure, intermediate hunting pressure, or even low hunting pressure, compared to forests that are not hunted, the abundance of these dung beetles are reduced, presumably because mammals or large mammals are no longer there, and of course the dung is either there. And in the case of fragmentation, those small fragments or medium-sized fragments have a lower abundance of dung beetles than larger fragments or continuous forests. Right, so I'm working on the questions that I showed before, but of course, at some point, I would like to make the next step on understanding how, because of all these changes in recruitment and the way some species, plant species, are going to have less recruitment by others. For example, wind dispersed species are not expected to be affected by deformation because they don't rely on animals, and of course, small seeded species which may be dispersed by smaller animals, they may also be unaltered by deformation. So this is important because its size is related somehow to wood density, and this in turn relates to the capacity of storing carbon by plant species. So large seeded trees are normally those that store the larger amount of carbon. So we have this kind of forest where large seeded tree species are non-dispersed, or we only have lianas or wind dispersed species or so on. We would expect that carbon storage capacity would be reduced in the future. And this is something that was explored some years ago using simulations, and others have done it this is focused on the Atlantic forest, but other people have done similar studies in Asia or across different regions. And here what it is just to simulate the extinction of large seeded trees and compare it to a random extinction. And they found that indeed the carbon balance would be decrease in the case of extinction of large seeded trees. Now, this varies across regions, and of course, this relies on the assumption that large seeded trees will become fully extinct. But as I tried to explain before, we don't really know yet what is going to happen with net recruitment rates and all those antagonistic and mutualistic animals having altered abundances in defaunated or half defaunated forests. But this is where I would like to go in the future, and of course I would like to do it massively across the tropics, which, as you see in this map, is the area that holds the higher carbon intensity in the world. So to recap, I would like you to go home with some few ideas about this talk. First, I have discussed how human accessibility can be used as a proxy for hunting pressure. Of course, this is a simplistic approach, and we could use some other approaches, but it's something that is operational at larger scales and can give us a first hint of where hunting pressure is the highest and where mammal populations and eventually bird populations could be defaunated, which is what I showed also, no? Like the 68 to 80% of the pantropical forest zone could be under some degree of defaunation, according to our models. I mean, these are model-based estimates, so of course it's just an indication, and this is how they should be treated. And then other take-home messages are the fact that forest cover per se is not equal to ecosystem intactness. I mean, you may have forests that look intact from sky or from satellite images, but they're actually very under very high hunting pressure, and they may have mammal communities which are actually depauperate. And then finally, I show how we can combine the effects of land use and hunting and see how both threats co-occur in some areas, whereas in others they are in isolation. And I think this is something that needs to be explored further because we know that threats don't act in isolation or overall. So this is something that I would also like to explore further in the future. And finally, I also show some very preliminary results about the effects of deformation and forest regeneration. With this, I want to acknowledge all the collaborators I've had in the past years, which I've learned so much from them, and I hope to continue to do great research with them and future collaborators, of course. And I leave here some of the papers I discussed during my talk, and I'm happy to take your questions if you have any. We'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much, Anna. If anybody's got any questions,
I was going to say, I hope there was not so much background noise because there are like kids playing football.
Just hear a few sirens. If anyone's got any questions, just you can either type it in the chat or just raise your hand and you ask. Maybe it's quite nice when you ask a question, or if for question time to turn on your cameras. It's a bit sad to sit staring at a blank screen. I see Victor's got his hand raised. Do you want to start, Victor?
Hello, Anna. Congratulations. Very nice talk, but also very interesting. So you didn't take some time to speak about the possible solutions of this crisis, because I live now, we are, here I am with a friend of mine we are making a reserve in Yucatan, in the Yucatan Peninsula, that is a hotspot of defaunation and habitat loss and all these things. We are trying to create a new reserve here, a natural reserve here, but we have this strong problem of hunting. So, and we are all days discussing about the solution. So I could like to know your opinion about what solutions do you know, or do you think we have?
Yeah, thank you, Victor. I'm glad that you like the talk. So yeah, of course, I mean, this is something that there's not a one shoe that fits all. Like this has to be based on the context, on the local context, and mostly what are the motivations for people to hunt. I believe in Mexico, of course, you still have some indigenous hunting and some people that rely on wild meat for basically because it's also their way of life. So with these people, normally, if they adhere to the traditional techniques or the traditional culture, usually they know how to manage the game, like in terms of having areas that they don't exploit during certain years and then focus on other areas and so on. However, the problem is that, of course, now there are more and more communities, so that means that there are less and less areas that can be actually unexploited. So I don't know if that's one of the cases you have. Of course, you may also have recreational hunters, so people that they don't really need to hunt anymore, but basically they know their grandparents did it, or they learn it from their parents, they like it, and they still do it because it's a social activity. I mean, this is something that we also have in Spain. Like hunting is, I mean, we don't need to hunt for feeding. We just do it because it's fun. Well, I don't do it, but you know, some people like it and it's a social activity. So what I'm trying to say here is that it depends on the group that you are targeting. And I don't know which groups are in your area, but what definitely you have to do is try to work with them and try to understand first the motivation for hunting. Second, you can understand whether they have a feeling that the species or the animals they used to hunt in the past, that whether they're still there or not. If they find that they are being lost, trying to emphasize that, okay, maybe we should, you know, target other species which are probably, well, maybe they may have higher reproductive rates and they may be able to recover from hunting pressure more easily. And then you can say, okay, maybe stop hunting this species for this amount of time. I don't know, but I think what works the best is just to do some participatory kind of approach where you sit down with the communities and try to understand why they hunt, do they need it, have they explore targeting other species, and also show them that this could be actually detrimental for them because they may lose their source of food if they don't, work together and collaborate. This is some basic ideas.
Yeah. I understand perfectly. Now it's very complex, and as you said, it depends on the region, on the country. Here, they are indigenous, but they lost all the traditional management of the animals, so now they are hunting a lot too much. And it's the young people that is hunting, and sometimes only because they don't have nothing to do. Now with the COVID,
Well,
I
yeah.
think they don't go to the school, so they are going to the forest to do something and take some animals and go home with animals. So it's a big problem, but I understand that you don't have the solution, and the solution may be regional specific, but you give me some important points. So
I think in some cases what have worked is that some people that used to be hunters have become nowadays guides for tourists that want to do wildlife watching, because in the end they are the ones that know where the species are, you know. So if you kind of convince them somehow that ecotourism could be a way of, you know, doing the same, no? You have to go into a forest, look for the species, you have to, you know, find it, and then the only thing that you don't do is to shoot it. But then you can get some income from some tourists that may want there to spot some wildlife. I don't know, this is another thing that I know has worked in some other areas. I think in Madagascar, actually, in Ramonafana, I was there a couple of years back, and I mean, one of my guides used to be a hunter. So, and nowadays he just uses his knowledge to basically show people coming from elsewhere where the species are and which species they are there and so on. So, yeah.
yes, thank you very much.
I have a question from Sham. His microphone's not working, so I'll just read it out to you. Have you considered the decline in the population of free-roaming domestic animals? And the follow-on is, in the tropics, they play a big role in secondary seed dispersal.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. I'm trying to read. In tropics also play a big role in secondary seed dispersal. No, I haven't looked into domestic animals at all. Just focus so far on wild species. In terms of secondary seed dispersal, no.
I have a follow-on question from that. Well, not really a follow-on, but it's quite a specific question. And I was looking at your data set with the seed regeneration. And for Africa, a lot of the data set I see is actually from tropical grass ecosystems that are wooded. So when you use the Hansen map, they come up often as forests, but functionally they're grassy, and many of the plants in there are adapted to herbivory. So if you use that I was just wondering, if you use that in a meta-analysis, you're probably going to start getting like confounding or, I suppose, converse effects. Like if you have defaunation in a tropical grassy ecosystem, trees do much better because their main predator is the sun. And forest trees have the opportunity to invade because then they don't have the herbivore defenses, and then so you might get this expansion of forest into these grassy ecosystems. And I was just wondering if that would confound your results by having those data
because
sets.
you're saying that from the map you showed that some of my points were on grassy ecosystems.
Yeah, so in the East African ones, there's a bunch in
I think those belong to the mountain forests over there. So not per se. I'm not including grassland ecosystems. It's mostly forested ones. So yeah, of course there are some savannas and so on, but these areas that you are pinpointing, I think, they are the, what's the name again? The Osungwa Mountains or something like that. I'm sorry, I don't know them by heart. But yeah, it's a mountain it's a mountain forest. But of course, I will look back into it and make sure that indeed that I'm not having these compounding effects, because I'm mostly interested on arboreal species basically and in forest ecosystems.
Yeah, it's also quite interesting because then often in these areas when you start burning, be they grassy ecosystems that are wooded or forests, sometimes fire covers some of the dormancy breaking mechanisms, or that you sort of replace some of the herbivore effects. And that's also just something I was wondering if you've come across.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Okay. No. Yeah.
If anyone's got any other questions,
I think Jedediah Brody.
yes, go for it.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
I don't know if I pronounced your name correctly, sorry.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks so much. That was just a wonderful talk, and I've followed your work for a while and just really enjoyed it. But it was super fun to see it all and hear it as a synthesis. I actually had a really similar question to Victor initially, but since you already answered that, my follow-up is more about the kind of policy implications of the carbon. So if you do find, if it does turn out that defaunation is going to have impacts on carbon storage in tropical forests, what do we do with that? Is there a way to incorporate that into RED or some other policy mechanism?
Yeah, that would be indeed a natural way to go, no? Like to try to incorporate it in RED programs and find a way to protect areas of forest because they hold high biodiversity, but they also have high carbon potential, and then basically just want to avoid that they, in this case, they don't become deforested, but mostly that they don't become defaunated. So, of course, being totally honest, I think the direct effects of forest conversion or deforestation are very clear and are very there. And these, what we are trying to explain here, these indirect cascading effects that may occur because animals are lost and the seed doesn't get there, is super difficult to communicate to politicians. And I guess you have probably wondered this many times because you also work on these kind of questions. So for me, it's one of the things that I find more difficult to communicate and to actually emphasize in my research. Also because whatever changes we're seeing nowadays, I mean, like the generation times of tropical tree species are very long. So we are not gonna be able to see this in the next 100 or 200 years. So it's like, okay, politicians are already busy enough to trying to avoiding to tackle climate change as it is nowadays. Now they have to think 200 years ahead on some forests that have lost animals. And then actually there's a logging company that want to use that other forest and it's going to, cut it like in 2 weeks or in, I don't know, in a year time. So it's very hard to actually balance or try to communicate what's important of this research. And of course, for me, it's not only about conservation and about global change and so on. It's also about all the ecology behind it and all the mechanisms and what I find interesting as a scientist. So, yeah. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that's super interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Anybody got any other questions? There's a useful paper that's been suggested in the chat.
Yeah, this came out recently. Yeah, I haven't read it yet, but yeah, this is I saw it coming out. This month, I think.
Yeah. So if there are no other questions or any comments, thank you, Anna, for a really interesting talk. That was fabulous. Yeah, and
thank you, Anna. It was really fun.
The recording will come up on YouTube probably this evening or by Monday. So then Yudvinda will tweet it out. So if you want to share it, it will be around.
Thanks a lot, and I hope you all have a good weekend over there.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you all. Thank you, Anna.
Bye.